So, as I reported the other day, the BBC has sacked its Match of the Day presenter and former English footballing hero Gary Lineker for opposing the genocide carried out by Israeli terrorists in Gaza. The BBC would say the real reason, according to me, behind Gary's departure is the BBC's seeming capitulation to the Israeli lobby. And I will explain how. But let's look at what happened and the shameful reactions by some of the notable people who held important positions in the BBC in the past. Both the BBC and Gary have issued statements. A statement by BBC Director General Tim Davies said, and I quote, I appreciate the last week has been difficult and emotional for many of you. Thank you for all the messages and conversations, even if some of them weren't easy to have. And I hope you understand that I had to wait until now to tell you the news. It is sad to be saying goodbye to such a brilliant broadcaster, and I also want to thank Gary for his years of service. As ever, if you have questions, you know where I am. Let's finish the season strongly with Gary's final show. Enjoy an incredible summer of sport and look forward with excitement to what lies ahead. End quote. Gary, for his part, said this.
Hi everyone, some personal news. Last week I shared a post here on Instagram that contained an emoji that has awful connotations. Unfortunately, I did not see the emoji. If I had, I would never ever have shared it. The minute I was made aware, I quickly deleted the post and went on to make an apology. I would like once again to say I'm sorry unreservedly for the hurt and upset caused. It was a genuine mistake and oversight, but I should have been more diligent. I know that. I've stood up for minorities and humanitarian issues and against all forms of racism all of my life, including, of course, anti-Semitism, which I absolutely abhor. There's no place for it and never should be. So I think it's best for all concerned that I step down from BBC presenting duties altogether and not do next season's FA Cup or World Cup. The final day of the Premier League season on Sunday will be my last show. It's been a pleasure and a huge privilege working with the BBC for 30 years, especially hosting Match of the Day, a programme that is so close to my heart and an integral part of my life. I'd like to thank all of the quite brilliant, talented and lovely people both in front and behind the camera that I've worked alongside for 3 decades. You're an absolute best. The relationship with the BBC has been long and wonderful, but it's the right time for the organisation and myself to go our separate ways. Thank you also to all of you for your incredible support and love over so many years. It means the world to me. I'll see you all on Sunday.
As expected, the topic has dominated conversations on both BBC and non BBC platforms. But while debating this topic, everybody is choosing to ignore the most important aspect of the controversy. Gary didn't put the rat emoji, let's be clear, while sharing the video on the malaise of Zionism. The emoji, a very small one, was hidden in the video that he shared. When he realized it, he was quick to delete the video and issue a public apology. That shows that he is not an anti Semite. But Israeli lobbyists in the UK use this to accuse him of being an anti Semite. This is a tried and tested tool for Israeli terrorists and their sympathizers in the West. When nothing works and when there's global condemnation to Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, let's create the false bogey of anti Semitism. And the BBC was only a willing partner as it agreed to capitulate to this vicious lobby. Just look at some of the debates this morning on BBC and LBC. BBC 5 Live invited one Roger Mossy, who was the head of news and head of sports during my time in the BBC. Listening to this chap's argument makes you wonder how he managed to rise so high in the BBC. His argument is that Gary has rightly been sacked because he owes his present fame to the BBC and not to his years of playing electrifying football and bringing laurels for his country. Can somebody tell this former head of news and sports that the reason why the BBC agreed to make Gary its highest paid presenter was because of the stardom that he earned as a footballer, not as a BBC broadcaster? That came later.
Well, let's speak to
Well, I
Roger
didn't
Mosey
say
for a
you
second,
were.
lads. We will come back to you in just a second. Let's speak to Roger. Roger, I think it's important to understand exactly what happens when you sign up to a BBC contract. So there is now a new clause, isn't there, in the last year as a result of some of the things Gary said in social media. So perhaps it's worth explaining that before we go back to Neil and Martin.
Yes, the BBC has always operated a policy in which some presenters, like news presenters like you right now, cannot tweet about impartial affairs or anything that's contentious because it's regarded as damaging the BBC's impartiality. People like Gary have always had more leeway because they're deemed not to be core news presenters. But I think the problem is that if you are also the BBC's highest paid presenter, and you're talking about the biggest issues of our time, about the EU referendum or Ukraine and Russia or Palestine and Israel, in that case, it's very hard not to associate those views with the BBC. So if you agree with them, you think, well, good on Gary for speaking out. If you disagree with them, you as a licence payer are essentially funding a guy who is taking political positions because of his BBC role. And I think, Gary would argue, I think reasonably, that he is, of course, a famous person in his own right, and he's got the right to speak out. But a lot of his current fame is because he's on the BBC and he's their best-known sports presenter.
So you truly understand where this chap is coming from. Listen to his argument in favor of the BBC calling Hamas terrorists for its 7th of October attacks, but not applying the same rule for Israelis when they commit genocide in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. This was he talking on a podcast by Roger Bolton in the immediate aftermath of the 7th of October attacks. Clip.
I was, for instance, very uncomfortable watching a report about the massacre at the kibbutz, in which the reporter, this was actually on Channel 4, but the reporter referred to Hamas militants. And that seems in that particular context to be the wrong word. If you are slaughtering babies in this unspeakable fashion, I think it is terrorism. So there are times when the word militant won't do in those circumstances. So I support the general policy, while at the same time thinking you have to be flexible on occasions to look at the actual story and call it what it is.
Although on that question of slaughtering of children, again, some people may think I'm being rather pedantic, but as far as I understand, that's a claim made by soldiers. It is very likely to be true, but I've noticed that Jeremy Bowen and other reporters have said, according to soldiers, because I'm not sure if any outsider reporters have actually seen the horrific bodies other than in body bags. I mean, I think it's a reasonable assumption that that's what has happened, but I don't think we actually know, do we?
I think that may be a fair point, Roger, but there is no question in my mind that what we saw in Israel at the weekend was terrorism by Hamas.
But I think if I was in Gaza, or maybe parts of the West Bank or whatever, and I was being bombed by Israeli aircraft, I would be terrified, and I would think, why are they doing this? And some would say, well, they're doing this it's an act of terror because they wish to stop you supporting in any way or any form the militants. And they would say, look at the scale of deaths, usually more Palestinians killed than Israelis. This is terrorism. And then they would also point, this is why it's so difficult, the activities of right-wing settlers in the past, going over into villages, burning them and so on. And they would say that's acts of terrorism. And so when once you start to use the word for one side, the other side will come and say, hey, well, what about this? What about this? I mean, isn't bombing large civilian settlements terrorism?
But slaughtering 250 or more people at a music festival is terrorism. And if it happened, God forbid, in the United Kingdom, we would call it terrorism.
On the other hand, LBC's Nick Ferrari invited a known pro-Israeli chap, Jonathan Sacerdote, on his show. What did you expect him to say? Of all things, he said that Gary was being thick in opposing a genocide.
I was a pretty lousy footballer when I was a lad at school. I got picked last in the playground if we lined up against the wall. And you know what? My interest and ability in that sport has remained pretty much nil. But that's why you wouldn't catch me going on television or on the radio or on Twitter to commentate about the World Cup or the Euros. Gary Lineker ought to learn that lesson. Just keep his mouth shut, not because he's embarrassing the BBC, because he's embarrassing himself. The guy is really thick, as far as one can tell. He claims he didn't know the picture of a rat would be offensive to Jews, after he also said that Suella Braverman's language some time ago, talking about immigrants, was reminiscent of Nazi Germany. So he can't have it both ways. Either he thinks he knows about that era of history, or he doesn't. But the idea of Jews as rats, and never mind that, the video itself was shocking, full of lies, full of rubbish.
But to employ your language, Mr. Sacerdoti, and this is your view, you're okay, so he's thick and he's stupid. Does that mean he can't have an opinion then? Can only intelligent people have opinions?
No, thick people are welcome to their opinions. They're even welcome to share them. But he was enjoying, 1.6 million
1.4
million of money, which is taken, at the threat of a criminal record, I think, from people who are paying the BBC licence fee.
Maybe only people who push the Israeli propaganda or those who provide cover fire for Israeli terrorists should be eligible for a fat salary at the expense of British taxpayers. Watch this fascinating montage put together by ex-user Saul Stanford.
What the ICJ now describe as plausible genocide.
This is not an act of you know what I'm going to have to say. I'm going to say Israel denies that. They say that they were in pursuit of Hamas terrorists who hid behind their own people.
Yeah, and this war started on October the 7th when Hamas went into Israel and attacked various kibbutzes and other sites, murdering hundreds of people, taking several hundred hostage.
You will know that Israel says its policy is not one of starvation. Well, the Israeli military, of course, says that it has provided corridors for aid to reach where it's needed.
Yeah, and Israel will say that, Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organisation by many countries around the world, do not operate in good faith, and that they wouldn't agree to release hostages who were alive. But what about Iran? What about Iran's role?
You talked at the beginning about genocide. As you will know, the Israeli government, the Israeli military completely deny that, and they will say, and do say, that they are responding militarily to the attacks of October the 7th by Hamas, that they are determined to destroy Hamas, to stop it ever carrying out another attack like that, another massacre like that killed or kidnapped hundreds of civilians.
I'm sorry, this is obviously a very personal, difficult situation for you and your family. And as you would understand as well, Israel would say, well, they can't live next door to Hamas.
Thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Israel itself says that it doesn't block aid going into Gaza.
A reminder that Israel would deny that it is carrying out war crimes in this situation. Dalal Irakat, Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution and Diplomacy at the Arab American University.
Israel would deny that a genocide is taking place, saying that it is defending its right to exist. Its very existence, indeed, they would say, is under threat. So there are obviously two sides to this. There are Hamas, who hold more than 100 hostages. It's not known how many of those are still alive. And then there is Israel's determination to wipe out Hamas.
The Israelis would say, well, look, we are defending ourselves. We are targeting Hamas targets in Gaza. We are trying to put an end to what we believe is a terrorist organisation once and for all.
Do you really keep a straight face when you say that?
This Jonathan Sacerdoti is no ordinary man. Last month, he appeared before the UK Foreign Affairs Select Committee to put up a robust defence of Israeli action in Gaza. This was at a time when Israeli terrorists had already slaughtered close to 60,000 people, mostly women, children and babies. And close to 2 million Palestinians were being made to starve by war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu.
In terms of how Israel or the IDF or the government is carrying out the war in Gaza, how effective is it at delivering those outcomes? And if, as you've stated, the only outcome is a sense of security and the return of the prisoners, hostages,
not prisoners.
So if that is the only end game, then what is the end game for the Palestinians? So there's two elements to that question. Is the way it's perpetrating the conflict at the moment conducive to achieving the release of the hostages? And actually, if hostages and security for Israel is the only desired outcome, what does, to use the chair's question, Israel look like in 10 years' time?
I'll try and answer that because I think it's a few questions rolled into one. So if you'll forgive me, the intended outcome for the Palestinians, you would have to ask them why they invaded Israel on that day, what their intended outcome was. But I think that the resulting outcome is that the proposition of some sort of negotiated settlement that would work more in their favour than is now the case has been pushed way into the long grass because of the horrific threats that actually manifested on that day.
And what to say of Nick Ferrari? This is what he had to say about Gary, who, according to him, has a tunnel vision.
I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I've met him only a few times. I just don't think there's an anti-Semitic bone in his body. But I do think he's become a little bit tunnel vision as regards this, and unfortunately in his concern, as so many sane people do, the concern they have for the number of people who are being killed or being seriously injured in Gaza, that has unfortunately rather coloured his views here, and he's sort of lost some of his finer antennae, is what I would say. But I wouldn't have him down as an anti-Semite for a split second.
The sacking of Gary Lineker further confirms the power that the Israeli lobby enjoys in the UK. After controlling the US politics and media landscape, the Israeli lobby has now proven that the UK politics and media industry too is now under its firm grip. This episode would be remembered as the moment when the BBC went from being a so-called credible media organization to an extension of the Israeli propaganda machinery. The BBC has demonstrated that you can keep your job and even be rewarded if you continue to act as a cheerleader of Israel's rogue regime. But you will not last even for a second if you speak for humanity or oppose a genocide. Gary Lineker's departure is not a loss for him, as he had already decided to part ways with the BBC after next year's World Cup. But what the BBC has done with its horrendous capitulation to the Israeli lobby is that it has forever lost its already compromised credibility. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your support of this platform and our journalism on buymeacoffee.com and Patreon. If you do think that our journalism is worth supporting, then you too should consider becoming part of it. Details are there in the description of this video. In the meantime, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.